In today's video, we will see how to securely authenticate your web app to the Azure SQL. As a prerequisite, you need to have your SQL database and Azure App Service deployed in your Azure resource group. At this stage, I don't have any connection established between my application and SQL database. And as a result, my product catalog API is giving me an error. Going back to the Azure portal now, before establishing the connectivity, let's first recall the requirements for security by design. As we saw in the previous video, the SQL database or SQL server is accessible only within the private network. The authentication should be passwordless, so there is no need to manage and maintain the secrets. And that should be a zero trust policy, which means nothing is trusted by default. So your app service would also need to be given required permissions on the SQL database. As a first step, we need to set the connection string in our web application. So here you can see multiple connection strings, but we need to copy the Microsoft Entra passwordless authentication connection string. And then within our web app, we need to add this connection string as an environment variable. And we need to make sure that the type is selected as SQL Server. This is how we have implemented passwordless authentication. As a next step, let's establish a private connection between the app service and SQL database. So I'll first create a virtual network. I have given it a meaningful name and I will keep the other settings as they are. Click on review and create, and we'll create a virtual network. Now within this virtual network, we will create two subnets, one for outbound connections from web application and the second one to act as a private endpoint for SQL Server. Let's create a subnet for outbound connections from web application. I have given a meaningful name here and I will keep rest of the settings as they are. One important thing is the subnet delegation where we need to select Microsoft.web/server farms. Now let's create a second subnet for a private endpoint. I have given a name to this subnet and there is nothing else that we need to do here. So our subnets are created with different IP ranges. Okay, so now we need to configure the outbound traffic configuration for the web app. So within your web app page, you will find the networking tab and here you have the outbound traffic configuration. Click on the virtual network integration, add virtual network integration, select the virtual network and the subnet that we created for the web app. Click connect. So now the outbound connection is configured. Okay, so now let's create a private endpoint connection for our SQL Server. So you will find this UI in the networking tab of SQL Server. Go to the private access, click on create a private endpoint. So I have given a name to this endpoint. Within the resource tab, we need to make sure that SQL Server is selected as a target sub resource. Now coming to the virtual network. So within the virtual network tab, we need to select the subnet that we created for private endpoint. And we can keep rest of the settings as they are. Let's create a private endpoint. So now the private endpoint is created and our web application can communicate with the SQL Server database. So now as a last step, just similar to any SQL user, we need to have a user created in the SQL Server and should be given DML operations permissions on the database. This requires a user to be created for the web application. And in order to do so, we need to go to the identity within the settings of the web app and we should turn the system identity on. And once you click on the save button, the web app would be registered as an app in the Entra ID. Okay, so now we need to execute queries in order to add a user in the database and also give required permissions to the user. I'm using SQL Server extension in Visual Studio Code, which is very handy. So I will now execute these queries. Product catalog service is the web application name, and the permissions DB data reader and DB data writer are given to this user on the database. Okay, so the query executed successfully. All the changes and configurations. Let's execute the API endpoint. Okay, it's giving an expected result now. It's very successful. So now our web app is seamlessly and securely connecting to the SQL server. That's pretty much for today's video. Thanks for watching.